When my small book on FDR and the 100 Days finally came out last June, it was met by complete silence and a lack of interest. I couldn't complain about this lack of response because it was 15 years after the date that I had promised the editor, Eric Fone, that he would have the manuscript. This began to change, at least in Britain, on September the 15th when Lehman Brothers collapsed. The Financial Times reported my account of FDR's handling of the banking crisis, and they picked up on the comment of Agnes Meyer, wife of the chair of the Federal Reserve, when Americans responded to FDR's fireside chat by putting more money back in the banks the next day than they withdrew. Agnes Meyer said, "Everyone is amazed. No one is more surprised than the bankers themselves." Julian Glover, the political editor of The Guardian, pondered what the unemployed employees of Lehman Brothers could do. He noted that, quote, "Everyone wants a New Deal to fend off depression, but so far, ideas as what should go into it have proved lackluster." He concluded from my book that, quote, "The original New Deal was far more imaginative. In Roosevelt's first week, he found time, in between rescuing the banking system and legalizing beer, to found a tree army that put the urban unemployed to work. Within 3 months, 270,000 men and women, no women, were camping out in the deep countryside. Whether today's ex-Lehman Brothers bankers," Glover went on, "would put up with being told, like one batch of FDR's recruits, to take care when collecting water, as the springs are full of rattlers and the creeks have their quota of cottonmouths, is uncertain," Glover went on. "What is clear," Glover said, "is that they need to be given something to do." After Obama's election, interest really began to pick up. Opening my email on Monday morning, November the 17th, I found a message from CNN urgently requesting a live TV interview. I was told President-elect Obama had mentioned reading a new book on FDR in the first 100 days the previous evening on his first major national TV interview since the election. It was flattering that CNN assumed it was my book he was talking about. CNN were undaunted by the fact that, as it turned out, he had been reading a different book. An earlier and very good one by Jonathan Alter. Anxiety increased during the day as a high-tech CNN van tried to make it through the streets of medieval Cambridge. And eventually I stood in the driving rain on the steps of Clare College, founded in 1326, telling American viewers about what their president-elect might be expected to learn from their own history. Finally, the BBC Today programme, which is the flagship radio programme for the BBC, on January the 1st was guest edited by Sir Wim Biscoff, chairman of Citigroup. He had taken to getting his senior managers, when they were down in the dumps, to read FDR's inaugural about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And Biscoff wanted me to talk about the inaugural. I commented that in some ways it was nonsense. FDR, I said, was simply wrong. The American people had to be a lot to be afraid of. And Wim's reaction is unrecorded. I venture to suggest that a realistic appreciation of fear might be a more relevant message to the senior managers of Citigroup today. Well, it's now difficult to look my students in the eye and lecture them about the importance of meeting deadlines. By spectacularly missing my own deadline, I've managed to produce a book just at the right time. Well, what did I conclude about the 100 days, and what, if anything, does it tell leaders like President Obama and Prime Minister Gordon Brown about how to respond to today's crisis? Well, the 100 days represented a stunning legislative achievement. They reopened the banks, guaranteed bank deposits. America went off the gold standard. America provided money, direct federal money and assistance to the unemployed. The American government told farmers what they could and could not plant under the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. It refinanced mortgages for farmers and homeowners. It established the Civilian Conservation Corps. Under the NRA, it told industries what prices could be charged and what wages could be paid. It regulated for the first time on the federal level the sale of securities, and it invested in the infrastructure, launching both the TVA and a $3.3 billion public works program. That last program, grudgingly accepted by Roosevelt and apparently very slowly implemented, was nevertheless 165%, that sum was 165% of the federal government revenues for 1933. It represented 5.9% of GDP. It represented about $45 billion in 2002 dollars. Well, what did all this stunning legislative achievement add up to? For historians on the left and the right, the 100 Days has become the defining moment of the 20th century. For Jonathan Alter, it created a new sense of, quote, social obligation, or as one historian remembered, something magical happened in the 1930s in which ordinary people felt that the government was on their side, that the federal government was protecting the powerless. But for economic historians, it was also the defining moment for a very different reason. Economic historians believe that the 100 Days and the New Deal afterwards explained why it took America so long to get out of the Depression compared to European countries. According to this interpretation, the 100 Days and the New Deal delayed recovery that would have come from going off the gold standard, from devaluation, delayed recovery because it raised business costs and discouraged private investment through labor legislation and through business regulation. So not surprisingly, it is also the defining moment for historians on the right. This is the big bang of the federal government in the 20th century, when America took, according to this interpretation, a decisive wrong turn. Most recently, this case is argued by Amity Shlaes, for whom Andrew Mellon and Calvin Coolidge are the heroes of the story, and Herbert Hoover and FDR are the villains for interfering with the free market. The economic case made by the economic historians is thus joined to a passionate moral critique. New Deal spending, essentially according to this interpretation, bribed the electorate, and its distribution was politically motivated. The New Deal promoted class warfare instead of class unity. It created a bureaucracy that was self-perpetuating and anti-business, and it was made up of people incapable of earning a living, except at the taxpayer's expense. This whole new system, this whole new political economy destroyed American traditions of voluntarism, self-help, and individualism. Well, that's how the historians see it. For all presidents after FDR, the 100 Days has become something of a standard, a benchmark against which they have to judge the first days of their administration. Even Richard Nixon established a 100 Days group when, after 80 days, he thought he might not have much to show for the first 100 days, but it was necessary to get a message out that there was something. Now, this 100 Days test is a test which most presidents have failed. For example, in 1961, the end of John Kennedy's first 100 days was marked by the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. But of course, it's not surprising that subsequent presidents fail the test, because the circumstances of 1933 were very specific, and there is a 100 Days trap, as the late Arthur Schlesinger used to describe it, a 100 Days trap for later presidents who try to set themselves up against that benchmark. But this time, it does appear to be different. Not just because CNN has its 100 Days coverage sponsored by ExxonMobil. There is a major financial crisis and an ensuing recession. A discredited outgoing president has been succeeded by a charismatic president who has an electoral mandate and large, though not as large as Roosevelt's, large congressional majorities. There is indeed an international economic conference, just as there was in London in 1933, an international economic conference that is trying to engineer and coordinate global economic recovery. Well, do Roosevelt's 100 days provide lessons for Obama's 100 days? I think, as I've indicated in that piece in The Nation, what is important in the first place was that Roosevelt's 100 days were almost an accident, and his response was largely improvised. Roosevelt had 4 months between his election and his inauguration on the 4th of March 1933. Yet he had no plans to solve the accelerating banking crisis and no carefully worked out recovery programs. He took advantage of the banking crisis and the very positive response that he got from congressional leaders. He took advantage of that to keep Congress in session and to work on the recovery, relief, and reform legislation that did go to make up that first 100 days. Of course, he took office on the day that the entire banking system ground to a halt when New York and Illinois governors closed their banks. Walter Wyatt, who was General Counsel of the Federal Reserve, was amazed at how unprepared Roosevelt's people were. There wasn't anybody, he said, in that entire brains trust, apparently, that had given any thought. They had absolutely no plans or any real study to the problem created by the banking crisis. So they had no alternative but to turn to the Treasury and Federal Reserve officials who were already in place for help. And these officials resurrected plans from the Hoover administration. Roosevelt then summoned Congress into special session, proclaimed a national bank holiday, and on the Tuesday, it was inaugurated on the Saturday, on the Tuesday, Wyatt remembers being called to the White House to draft a banking bill. Well, what did they want? The reply was, to the very least, spare, ratify the banking holiday, preferred stock in the national banks, the Bank Conservation Act, and a few things like that, Wyatt recalled. I had a little slip of paper in my hand about that big, and I wrote one line on each subject. That's all I had to go by. And that really determined the Banking Act. Neither bankers nor Roosevelt's administrative team nor congressional leaders had much to add. Indeed, Wyatt told the White House, in the few hours we've got, you can't improve this thing, that was the bill he drafted, and you might ruin it. When the House of Representatives passed the banking legislation on the Thursday, the day the House came back into session, they only had one copy of Wyatt's bill with penciled amendments on it, and they passed it after 43 minutes of debate. The Senate was slightly more deliberate, but passed the bill later the same day, after 7 hours of debate. You'll remember that President Obama clearly had hopes that likewise his stimulus package would pass on day one of this administration. Of course, as you know, over the next 3 days, the Treasury worked with banking officials to try and work out which banks were safe to reopen, and they didn't really know. But they recognized that if the banking crisis was to be solved, ultimately it would depend on a man-to-man appeal for confidence by the president, and that's when Roosevelt gave his first fireside chat on Sunday, March the 12th. As you remember, he told Americans that it was safer to put money back into the bank than it was to keep the cash under a mattress. And Americans believed him. And the next day, sure enough, money flowed back into the banks that had been allowed to reopen. It's important to remember what a tremendous gamble and risky gamble this was. There was no plan B. If Americans had continued to keep their money out of the banks, to take their money out, absolute disaster would have followed. The difference between success and failure was extraordinarily narrow. Roosevelt had no carefully worked out plans for recovery. There was no great federal blueprint for FDR that FDR wanted to impose on the country. If the 1930s was the big bang for the federal government in dramatically increasing the size of the federal government and the role of the federal government, it's not what Franklin Roosevelt envisaged in 1933. He had sort of semi-clear plans about agriculture, about the Civilian Conservation Corps, and he wanted to do something bold in the Tennessee Valley. But he seized opportunities. Once Congress was in session, he was persuaded to keep it in session, to pass, first of all, the farm recovery legislation. And again, he expected to pass the farm recovery legislation in a week, and it took the best part of 6 weeks to get the farm bill through Congress. 40 days into the 100 days, there was no indication that there would be an industrial recovery program. Only when Congress threatened to pass share the work legislation, which would have mandated a maximum 30-hour week for American workers, for all American workers, only then did Roosevelt propose the National Recovery Act. And as for relief, as for welfare, William Bremner has written, FDR did not come into office with a blueprint of federal relief plans in hand. He only brought the person who turned out to be one of the most important people in the New Deal, Harry Hopkins. He only brought Harry Hopkins down to Washington to set up a national relief program when it was clear that existing appropriations to the states were going to run out. Roosevelt was deeply skeptical of large-scale public works spending. He really only thought that there was probably, at best, $1 million worth of proper projects in that could be put into practice. And he opposed the federal guarantee of bank deposits. Why should you benefit irresponsible bankers? He accepted both those measures, large-scale public works programs and the insurance of bank deposits, only when it was clear that Congress was going to pass them in any case. His new agencies scoured Washington to try and find rooms to operate. Harry Hopkins requisitioned an office and a chair, but not a desk, in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation building. To launch a relief program from scratch, he later recalled, was, quote, almost as if the Aztecs had been asked suddenly to build an aeroplane. He got hold of existing state applications to the RFC, which had not yet been approved, and he spent $5 million in 2 hours. Arthur Morgan set up the Tennessee Valley Authority in a borrowed room in the Willard Hotel. He remembered, we hadn't any space yet. There was mail piled around in stacks, and in burrowing through this, we would find an important letter from the president, piled under a 3-foot stack of mail. We would finally find letters from congressmen, department heads, writing to know what to do about this appropriation or that. Now, it's important to remember that desperate times and an economic emergency impose constraints on a president just as much as they offer opportunities. Now, in 1933, unlike today, in 1933, Roosevelt had to act very quickly without the apparatus of an effective, powerful federal government. He had to act quickly to reopen the banks, to put people to work, to provide relief for the unemployed, and to assist farmers. It was essential that that was quick. And yet, America did not have a government that could deliver speed. For most Americans, their only contact with the federal government was through the post office or through the small peacetime military. Only 3% of Americans paid federal income tax in 1933. Now, in other words, the government had neither the information to dictate policy, nor the personnel to implement policy in any way that could operate in a top-down program. Who knew which banks were safe to reopen? Well, the government didn't know. It was the bankers themselves who had the best chance of knowing. Who knew their industries well enough to draft codes under the NRA, and they drafted 543 codes under the NRA for all sorts of industries in the United States. Well, the only people who really knew anything about those industries were the business leaders themselves. If you were going to try and persuade farmers to reduce their acreage, or in some cases, in the case of cotton, to destroy their acreage in the summer of 1933, how are you going to get them to sign contracts? And how are you going to be guaranteed that they were telling the truth when they signed their contracts? Well, the only people who could do that were the neighboring farmers in committees of farmers elected by at the local level. Who could administer this new federal relief program that Harry Hopkins was going to run? There were no federal agencies that could do it. Hopkins never employed more than 700 people in Washington. He had to turn to existing state government relief administrations. How are you going to get 250,000 young men from the cities and set them to work in the countryside under the Civilian Conservation Corps in camps that would have to be constructed in the middle of nowhere by the end of July? Well, only the army could do that. So it's not surprising then that Roosevelt, faced with this sort of lack of state capacity, as the political scientists describe it, the lack of an effective federal government, it's not surprising, therefore, that Roosevelt had a penchant for quick fix solutions, solutions that might bring painless recovery without a permanent expansion of the bureaucracy or without constant state intervention. And of course, one of his biggest battles was to cut government spending. That's the thing that he invested most political capital in 1933, in the Economy Act, which passed within a week of the reopening of Congress. That cut government employees' salaries, it cut the pensions to veterans, deeply unpopular, a measure that he only got through with Republican support. But slashing government spending was seen as being a prerequisite for recovery. But it was going to cut government, not increase it. He liked the idea of propaganda, or was prepared to resort to the idea of propaganda drives to encourage businessmen to keep their wages up and keep their prices up. Above all, he always liked the idea of currency inflation, some way of raising the price levels, particularly for farmers. And he never lost hope, certainly right through 1933, that some sort of tinkering with the currency, and there was a particularly famous and derided gold buying scheme which led to Dean Acheson resigning from the government, derided by the experts. He never lost hope that that sort of tinkering, a one-off move, get the price level right, would raise prices, particularly of farm products, and in itself bring recovery without any permanent government continued intervention. Now, of course, one non-statist option was the international option. Revive world trade. Do it through currency stabilization and the elimination of tariff protection throughout the world. Stop the constricting beggar-thy-neighbor policies of competitive devaluation by each nation anxious to get a competitive advantage, and the concomitant erection of high protective tariffs, all of which gradually strangled world trade. Well, international expectations of Roosevelt were enormous in the prospect of coming to this London Economic Conference in the summer of 1933. Throughout the 100 days, European leaders came to Washington to enlist Roosevelt's support for precisely that, currency stabilization and the removal of trade barriers. And characteristically, Roosevelt led them to believe that he agreed, that he would work to restore the equivalent of the gold standard and revive world trade. But of course, that would have imposed a discipline of a balanced budget, and it would have prevented the administration from raising domestic prices. Now, as you know, Roosevelt scuppered the London Economic Conference with a bombshell message that undercut both Secretary of State Cordell Hull and his political advisor, Roosevelt's political advisor, Ray Moley. European leaders, of course, blamed Roosevelt for the failure of the London Economic Conference. The British felt particularly badly let down. One of their officials noted that the only achievement of the London Economic Conference was to have created the longest bar in the Western world, which the senator from Nevada, Key Pittman, spent a lot of time at. But although the European leaders and the British in particular blamed Roosevelt, actually they had no real intention of surrendering the economic advantages that they had gained from their own protective tariffs and their devaluations. And it was an important failure. The one person who benefited from the failure of the London Economic Conference was the newly elected Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler. And Hitler took the lesson from the failure of the London Economic Conference, that the democracies were palsied, that they would not act in a cooperative and coordinated manner to defy Germany. And he believed that economic diplomacy, in other words, then became something that couldn't be used against Hitler effectively in the 1930s. State Department officials learned something different from that, or perhaps they learned the same message, but the people who'd seen at first hand the failure of the London Economic Conference were very influential in the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, which attempted to do what the London Economic Conference had failed to do in 1933. International expectations of President Obama, of course, are arguably even greater. But I think I do have to note that there will be a lot of leeway given to President Obama by the Europeans, who are very keen on him, at least according to public opinion polls. But in the long run, they will be only too happy to blame the United States for failing to make sacrifices, for example, in energy policy, that they themselves have no intention of making in the first place. It's been very convenient these last few years for Europeans to blame the Americans for failing to sign up to the Kyoto Protocol, when in fact most European nations don't have any intention of adhering to those strict energy guidelines themselves. Macroeconomic intervention, the sort of detailed intervention in the economy in the 100 days, didn't necessarily work. The NRA, as we know, probably checked the downfall in the deflationary spiral, stopped wages and prices getting lower and reducing purchasing power ever downwards. But it didn't create new jobs. And scarcely anybody in the 1930s, and certainly not in 1933, envisaged the levels of government spending that would be needed to bring about recovery. What I think is probably Roosevelt's biggest mistake in 1933 was the failure to provide loans to business to finance new investment and expansion. That was in the original recovery legislation, and it sort of disappeared. It's interesting that historians very rarely talk about the disappearance of this aspect of the NRA. But it probably, I think, looking back, was the single greatest weakness of Roosevelt's program in 1933, that they allowed that to go. It's important to remember that Roosevelt, for all his emphasis on economic recovery and for all his emphasis on focusing on the economic crisis, did not allow that to postpone automatically reform measures. He established the regulatory principles for banking and securities reform and the reform of the stock market. That changed a little in 1934 and 1935, essentially produced financial stability in the United States for the next generation. Until, of course, they were dismantled very consciously and cheerfully in the 1980s and 1990s. And, of course, historically, right-wing historians have denounced this regime of regulation as something that deterred investment because it imposed costs on business. That scorn for 1930s regulation has looked particularly unconvincing since September. For example, critics believe that the separation of investment and commercial banking, which occurred in 1933 under the Glass-Steagall Act, had been, quote, a knee-jerk pandering to a congressional witch hunt that had highlighted stock market excesses and malpractice. And in 1999, they celebrated the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. They believed that repeal removed unnecessary obstacles to dynamic financial services. Well, as American investment houses now seek classification as commercial banks, the Glass-Steagall provisions now look eminently sensible. Half a century of stable financial institutions does not look a bad result for New Deal regulation. And of course, in the 100 days, Roosevelt launched the Tennessee Valley Authority, a remarkable program that probably could only have been passed in 1933. But he delayed Social Security. He'd promised Francis Perkins that there would be Social Security legislation. That wouldn't, in fact, come until 1935. But Roosevelt did show, and the New Deal did show, that you can have social reform in a depression. And many American reform movements, like the Great Society in the 1960s, have been the product of periods of prosperity. But this was social reform in a period of depression. The last point I'd make about the New Deal is that it did bring a remarkable generation of young people to Washington to staff the emergency New Deal agencies: intellectuals, lawyers, economists, farm specialists, and social workers, particularly women social workers with social policy expertise that took them to the senior levels of government in large numbers for the first time. There's been a tendency to dismiss them as communist dupes, impractical theorists, do-gooders who had never met a payroll. But I think, on the whole, that they provided a model for disinterested public service that was both socially concerned and competent, which stood American society in very good stead until the 1960s. Now, Obama has brought a lot of young people into the political process. It's to be hoped that he brings them into government. The fact that so many places in the Treasury at the moment are unfilled doesn't perhaps give a lot of confidence that that's in fact what is going to happen. The Cabinet Secretary at number 10 in Britain complained only last week that when you ring the Treasury, no one answers the phone. And I'd also point to the remarkable appointments that Roosevelt made to his cabinet. No cabinet member, William Woodin died, but no other cabinet member left Roosevelt's administration in his first term. That's highly unusual. 3 cabinet members, Henry Wallace, Francis Perkins, and Harold Ickes, were still in Roosevelt's cabinet in 1945 when Roosevelt died. Well, what are the lessons for Obama? First, as Obama himself said earlier today in London, the situation in 1933 was different from today. The Depression had lasted for over 3 years. Unemployment was up possibly to a third of the industrial workforce. It's significant it says something about the capacity of American federal government in 1933, but they didn't know how many people were out of work. Agriculture, which constituted a third of the workforce in the nation, was destitute. And there were none of the stabilizers or social safety net, as Obama described them today, to soften the blow. No guarantee of bank deposits, no welfare system, no social security, no unemployment insurance. There was a sense of desperation in 1933 that even in today's climate is missing. No wonder in 1933 that there were so many analogies to the First World War, to wartime conditions. No wonder there was so much talk about the desirability of dictatorship. That talk is absent today, and the key effect of this changed situation is, I think, on Congress. In 1933, politicians in both parties heard remorselessly from their constituents that they had to support the president. That was particularly important for normally conservative Southern Democrats, who heard from their farming constituents that they were desperate for relief. And of course also, guided by much the same principle, for the sizable bloc of Western progressive Republicans. And today it's clear that some centrist Democrats, but certainly all Republicans, feel almost none of that equivalent pressure. I might note that in 1933, Congress was not air-conditioned. There was great pressure in a Washington summer to pass legislation in order to get home. And today, that is absent as well. Second, I think 1933 shows that the free market alternatives advocated by both economic historians and right-wing ideologues assume that the American people had an infinite capacity for endurance. There was violence in the rural America, which indicated that the patience of farmers was rapidly being exhausted in the early 1930s. We talk a lot about the stoicism of the unemployed during the 1930s, but New Dealers going around the country were in no doubt that there was a potential for violence and disorder. The notion that a government could simply reopen the banks, allow devaluation to take effect in a way that an Andrew Mellon or a Calvin Coolidge would have been preferred, completely ignores political reality and the danger of catastrophic social breakdown and the unleashing of anti-democratic forces. It's true today, however, that you don't see the ideological radicalism and grassroots activism that could be found in the 1930s. Though it's important to remember that the New Deal stimulated, as much as it diffused, grassroots activism. Labour played very little role in 1933. in policy making. Taxpayers' leagues, economy-minded taxpayers' leagues, were at least as powerful. And as for Huey Long, he always seems to me to have been the Lou Dobbs of 1933. Third, however much it rankles, you probably do have to bail out the banks. There was plenty of anger in 1933 against bankers, but in 1933, the banking crisis was a symptom of the Depression rather than the cause. And today, of course, Obama has to deal with the perception that the bankers are responsible for the Depression. Next, you need to loan money to industry for expansion. But the experience of the NRA is that you should tie conditions to those loans. Maybe the auto bailout is along those lines. Next, to create jobs in the private sector, you have to spend even more money than you envisaged. And Roosevelt wouldn't do that until 1938. But it's also important to remember that Roosevelt's public works spending was not earmarked. Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, and Harry Hopkins certainly had political considerations in mind when they distributed government in spending, but basically, they were free to make decisions in the national rather than the local or pork interest. What does work both in the short term and in the long term, according to the lessons of the 30s, is investment in the infrastructure. Roads, education, the land, water. Eventually, there were New Deal projects in all but 3 of the more than 3,000 counties in the United States, and they physically transformed the United States. They also made the United States physically capable of fighting World War II. Then you don't have to abandon reform because of economic crisis, but you may have to wait for some of the reforms that you want. Finally, and I think this is a message that President Obama ought to be reasonably happy about, you have to get money into the hands of ordinary Americans, victims of the credit crunch, as quickly as the New Deal did. In the case of the New Deal, getting men to work, giving money to the unemployed, giving assistance to farmers. Democrats are worried that they will support Obama's stimulus package and then face defeat in the polls in 2010, just as an earlier group of Democrats were defeated in 1994. But the lesson of 1933 is that if you do get money into the hands of ordinary Americans quickly enough, the midterm elections, as in 1934, will go in your favor, even if full-scale recovery has not been achieved. Thank you very much.